Zhiwen, inscribed at a staging post to the north of Dayu Mountains. In the 10th month, geese fly south again. I'm told it's here they begin their journey back. As for me, I'm not yet free to leave, and cannot say when that time will come. The river here is quiet. The tide's about to turn. Heavy vapors still obscure the woods. Early tomorrow, I'll gaze towards my home. Who knows? I may see the Gansu plum trees. So, this is a poem by Zhiwen. As we've been explaining of late, the group of the last four poems, five with this one, are poems composed by early Tang poets. Zhiwen was quite a famous early Tang poet. He and Shen Chuanqi were usually paired together, and this makes sense not only because their literary productions were quite similar in style. They were both born on the same year. They both passed the Jinxi examination in the same year, and they both served one of the favorites of, in the coterie of one of the favorites of Empress Wu Zetian, and both experienced the negative consequences of this when when the new emperor, the son of Wu Zetian, took the throne in 705, Emperor Chongzong. They were sent into exile, and Zhiwen was a bit more unlucky perhaps than Shen Chuanqi, probably because he was more immersed in politics and he kept trying to go back. He very soon managed to get back to court, and he participated there in some intrigues. He got some posts. He was accused of corruption. He was exiled again. Finally, in 712, I believe, the first year of Emperor Xuanzong, he was ordered to commit suicide in his remote southern destination in lieu of a public execution. So what we have here is the typical Chinese poem on being far from home. So this is a typical, the topic of this poem is traveling, parting. The poetic persona that is speaking in this poem that might be equated with Zhiwen is in the remote south of China, very far from his homeland, which we might imagine will be the north area of China, the Yellow River Valley. And he doesn't know when he'll go back, and he is lamenting that and making a comparison with the seasonal flight of geese. So that's practically the only topic of this poem. It's quite short, like all Liu Xi, but the topic is just representing the feeling of homesickness, of sadness at being far from home, which also includes being far from the court, and the subtones of being in exile, in internal exile, and of missing here not only his home and the court and his relatives, but the beautiful sights of the north. So the poem is set in the Dayu Mountains. I haven't checked exactly where they are, but from something that I've read elsewhere, this poem was composed when the poet was in the south of China, probably in what was in Tang times called Lingnan, the southernmost province, or at least that was the circuit, the southernmost circuit of China, close to modern-day Canton. An area of the tropical climate where seasonal change is very scarce or absolutely imperceptible for the most part, except for the monsoon rains coming and going. And so this poem was inscribed at a staging post to the north of the Dayu Mountains. The title says it was quite common for Tang poems to be written on the walls of inns or of different buildings, or left in the hut of a hermit who you went to visit if he wasn't there. So it was quite a common thing, and these are short poems. It's not that difficult to to write it on the wall of a plastered surface. Anyway, we've talked about the main topic, and I think we've given all the background information we need. Let's take a look at the poem couplet by couplet. In the 10th month, geese fly south again. I am told it's here they begin their journey back. So as is usual in a lot of Chinese poems, the poem starts with a nature image, which will function as a contrastive or a correlate to the poet or the personas that appear in the poem. Geese are migrating birds, and they usually appear in Chinese poems as symbols of separation, also sometimes of communication, of letter exchanges between people who are separate, based on remote legends of using geese as messenger birds. So it's the 10th month, which in the Chinese traditional calendar would have been the first month of winter. And the geese fly south. They have spent the warm season in the north, and now they're going to the subtropical south to spend the winter. And somebody probably has told Song Zhiwen that the place where he is at, that staging post, is a place where a lot of geese are usually seen. And that is the place where the geese, when they go back north again, when the northern winter is over, that is the place where many of them at least seem to use as the starting ground for their return to the north. Next couplet. So this presented a nature image of geese who fly south, and we are at a location where they then fly north up again. The cycles of nature. Nature is always cyclical. Spring always comes. Migrating birds always return. But this is contrasted with man. Man dies. Man's life is finite and not cyclical. One grows old. Even if one returns, one is no longer the same person. And here we've got an exile that goes south but cannot return north until who knows when. In fact, from the biographical information we have of Song Zhiwen, depending on when this poem was written, the answer could be never again. It's the second couplet. As for me, I'm not yet free to leave, and can't say when that time will come. So, pretty prosaic, pretty straightforward. A contrast between the geese and the poet. The poet knows he's an exile. He cannot follow the flows back north until he is given permission by the court to return to the capital. When? Who knows, if ever. So the next couplet shows us a description of nature, of the brief nature that appears in this poem. It's not very detailed and not very specific. I would task it for being too generic. You get no impression that this is in the south of China. It could be anywhere. So the river here is quiet. The tide's about to turn. Heavy vapors still obscure the woods. So this seems a pretty straightforward and simple description of nature, with a quiet river, a tide about to turn, heavy vapors hiding the woods. I don't know to what point we're meant to interpret these natural sights, the scenery, symbolically, as an attempt, maybe a rhetorical attempt by the poet, to answer the question of when he will be back, or to corroborate his feelings that he's in exile and doesn't know when he will be back. So the river is quiet, the tide is about to turn. Is the tide turning, following its natural cycle, like the geese are returning, or will return in the future back to the north? Is the tide perhaps a symbol of the desire, of the wish of Song Zhiwen that his own tide should turn, and that he should return north as well? And heavy vapors still obscure the woods. Perhaps these vapors are meant to evoke the uncertainty of Song Zhiwen's future, his lack of knowledge about if he will return, and if he will, when. Conclusion, the last couplet does not make a philosophical conclusion or a message clear, but it does express the feelings of homesickness through a hyperbolic image that the poet is experiencing. He says, "Early tomorrow I'll gaze towards my home. Who knows? I may see the Gansu plum trees." So the poem finishes with a wish. The poet is going to get up tomorrow and look north with the hope, which is an absurdly vain hope, of seeing the Gansu plum trees. Gansu was in the extreme north. So at least more than 500 kilometers from where Song Zhiwen must have been residing here. So the perspective of seeing the plum trees of his homeland is ludicrous. It's just a hyperbole, perhaps to denote how much he misses, how much he wishes he could see the trees, the vegetation, and by metonymy, the rest of the north, that is his homeland. In another translation that I've read, this last line was made a little bit less hyperbolic, and what he is expressing is that he hopes to see the mists that are like the plum trees or the plum flowers in his native north. But Chinese poetry is very ambiguous, very ambivalent, and I imagine both interpretations are perfectly possible, or even more. But anyway, whatever interpretation we make, it's clear that it's a sigh and a longing expressed in this image for returning back home. So, not a bad poem, not much more to say about it. Perhaps the strongest effect is the last hyperbolic image that it contains. It would feel a rather conventional, a rather trite poem on the topic of being far from home, on a traveler or an exile's misfortunes, were it not for the fact that through biographical information, we know that this isn't just an exercise in pedantry or in adapting to a topic. It's a reflection of Song Zhiwen's real experiences and real life. And this is something that in our Western tradition we tend to value a lot, sincerity in poetry. And this poem feels a bit sincere because we know that background of the poem, as opposed to the previous one by Shen Chuanqi, which does not feel sincere because it's just a recreation of a military ballad, and we have no information of Shen Chuanqi having served in the frontiers and fighting. So not a bad poem, not a bad poem, and a sad recreation of being far from home.